Welcome to the first Ideas at Neve 2021 session. We are excited to have Ratish Balakrishnan with us today. We began Ideas at Neve with high school students in 2019 for lectures by scholars in diverse fields to build knowledge, viewpoints, and passions. The lectures include topics from history, politics, medicine, research, technology, anthropology, sports, industry, arts, etc. We have taken this series now across the TOK sessions. We have taken them across the PYP exhibition sessions as well. Our aim is to inspire first students with different experts and then the rest of the community as well. For who knows which child will turn around 20 years later and credit his dream or her dream and possibly their future to a talk today at Neve by a travel writer, an astronaut, or a great artist, or a social entrepreneur. Ideas at Neve aims to make our school a melting pot of ideas. Ratish Balakrishnan graduated from the prestigious Indian University, BITS Pilani, completing a master's in data systems. He is co-founder and managing partner at Sattva, a very unique consulting firm that started with an audacious dream to end poverty in their lifetime. How wonderful is that? Ratish began his career as a researcher at INSEAD, a leading school in France, at the Center for Advanced Learning Technologies, working with the European Commission and his partners on e-learning and knowledge management in research projects. He also wanted to be volunteering in all this time and supporting social causes, and his friends at INSEAD were advising him that the action for this really was in India, with so much happening in the country. Ratish returned to India in 2004 and took up a job at SAP, one of the leading partners in the technology space, leading organizations in the technology space. His decision to return to India did not go very well with his family. But in hindsight, he thinks it was the right one because of what he made out of it. By volunteering, by participating in so much other work in the social space and beyond that, and eventually starting Sattva with a few of the alumni, few of his friends from BITS Pilani. Sattva is a consulting firm that focuses on the social sector to achieve scalable solutions for social impact. As part of this role, Ratish works with foundations, corporations, NGOs, and governments in conceptualizing and implementing large-scale solutions that positively impact the poor. He has worked across many spaces, including education, healthcare, skill development, livelihoods, women empowerment, forced labor, and child rights. Now, before we start today's session and welcome our speaker, here are a few points to remember, students. About 25 minutes into the session is when we will be able to take your questions and put them to the speaker. Please address your questions in the Q&A box. You have the Q&A box, please use that. You can put the questions up whenever you think of them, or you can put them up towards the end of the talk. I'll take up as many questions as I can. If you raise your virtual hand, we won't be able to attend to your questions. Hence, please use the Q&A box to share your thoughts or your questions with us. And now, let's welcome Ratish Balakrishnan as he speaks to us on solving India's poverty crisis. Welcome, Ratish.
Thank you for the very, very generous introduction, Kavita, and thanks to all of you who joined the discussion. I know you have an entire day in front of a computer, and to finish that and then still be able to make it to the session, I know is an achievement. So really appreciate you taking the time, and I want to make sure that this session is in service of you, right? What I want to make sure at the end of this presentation is that I've given you enough insights or enough inputs for you to sort of think about how whatever we are discussing today is going to be part of your everyday life. Yeah. So that would be success for me today. I thought we could.
I'm over to you. I will just, I'll come back in at about 25 minutes.
Excellent. Thanks, Kavita. Right. So I'll just take over from here. I want to maybe start with a quiz. And I know all of you are very comfortable with Mentimeter, knowing that you use it as part of your schoolwork as well. And so this is the code 97111408. I'd love to have all of you join and maybe start asking a few questions before I go on to the presentation. So it's 97111408. Excellent. Just give you guys a minute to come in and then we'll get started. Awesome. So the next set of slides have a few questions about the kind of topics we're going to talk about, but I just want to understand just how you see, how you understand the world today before I get on with the questions, because this will also give me a sense of where you are right now. I'll just move on to the first question. The question is, over the last 10 years, let's say before the pandemic, because the pandemic data is still not fully available to us, has poverty in India actually gone up or come down? Have people become poorer over the last 10 years, or have they actually, people have actually gotten out of poverty? Excellent. Great. Okay. Just give it a little bit more time. I'm not giving you the answers till now, and we'll talk about it as we go through the presentation, but I'd love to hear how you think about it. So I think the majority of you, and it's 2:1 at the moment, where people feel like poverty has actually gone up in India today, and increasingly people are becoming poorer than richer. Okay. It's interesting. I'll just move on to the next question. I know 93 of you have answered. Maybe we'll reach 100 and then we will move to the next question. I think the overwhelming evidence is that yes, poverty is going up, but it's not coming down. Okay. Cool. What is your estimate? And if none of you guys are using Google, of the number of children between the age of 5 and 10, this is really primary education, right? This is PYP in NEEF. What percentage of children are actually in school? Is it 53%, 72%, 85%? And there was another option there, I think it was 96%. So what percentage of children do you think are actually in school? And when I mean in school, I mean they're enrolled in school, right? Because attendance data is very hard to get by, and this is again before pandemic. I'm not talking about during the pandemic, which has been a crazy time. And I think a lot of you believe that 53%, more than half of you believe that more than half of the children in India between the age of 5 and 10 are actually not in school, right? Because only 53% are in school, which means that 47% children are out of school. Yeah, again, 97 people. At this time, I think we might actually hit that elusive 100. Yes, we did. Okay, so this is the second question. Which of these organizations actually do not work for the poor? So do we have a sense of who works for the poor and who doesn't? Out of the list of organizations here, I have a few, and there are 2 of you who've said investors don't work for the poor. 1 of you said nonprofits don't work for the poor. Okay. Companies don't work for the poor. Startups don't work for the poor. Okay. Investors seems like the most common use case, right? Like it doesn't seem like they work for the poor. Like 32 of you believe investors don't work for the poor. 12 of you think that startups don't work for the poor. 21 of you believe all of these organizations actually work for the poor, which is interesting. Okay. Again, 100. 49. So again, 50% of you believe investors don't work for the poor. 23 of you actually believe that all of these organizations work for the poor, but we will see what the right answer is as we go forward. Okay, last question. Actually, these are the questions I had. So let's start with the presentation and see where we land with all of these questions and more. Oh yeah, this is one more question that I had, sorry. Who is a poor person? Seems like a very straightforward answer. Just who's a poor person? And it's an open question, so any of you could answer anything. Whatever you think defines a poor person. A person whose income is below the poverty line. Great. So there is a poverty line, and anyone who is below the poverty line is poor. A person who can't get educated and has no money. Okay. People who don't have much money, someone below the poverty line. Uneducated people are poor people. Someone who's unable to afford the living standards they desire. Okay. This is a very interesting answer. I want to come back to that. A poor person does not have a lot of money, might not have a home. Someone who can't afford 2 meals a day. Okay. A person who doesn't have freedom to make choices. Great. A person whose annual income falls below the poverty line. Interesting. Someone economically unstable, gaining an income that's not substantial for the person to survive. Fantastic. No income, no shelter, no way of getting food. So roti, kapda, makan, low quality of life. Someone who doesn't have enough money to lead. So money really is going to define, because all of us understand poor as economic poverty, which makes sense to say somebody who does not have money is basically poor. Okay. Anyone who has only the necessities but cannot afford luxuries like a car is actually poor. Okay. A person with few or no capital assets. Okay. And low purchasing power. Interesting. Anyone who can't reach basic necessity. Okay. Poor mentally, which means they have bad mental health. Anyone who is poor mental health could be poor. Okay. It's interesting, and this is a question that I'd like you to sit with as you are going through the session, and I would come back to this, again and again during our conversation, because it is a very, very important question, right? To say all of us want to help the poor, but who is poor? I think will be helpful to understand. Okay. Poverty line is very, very, very common. I think you've brought it up multiple times. Who's unable to pay bills? People who are bankrupt. People who are unable to obtain basic needs. Right. Okay. And who's homeless? Is a poor person. So 103. Great. I know we have limited time, so I want to pause this, but this is very helpful. Thank you for participating actively, and I think we'll come back to this. I'm going to save this as well. I was thinking about what to call the presentation today, and I said, I don't want to call it Introduction to Philanthropy. I don't want to talk about, poor poverty, etc. I actually wanted to talk about how to change the world, and I named this presentation "How to Change the World" for 2 reasons. The one reason is it's actually the name of the book that I read, which was one of the first books I read about poverty. For anyone who wants to read inspiring stories of how people across the world are changing the world, the book How to Change the World is actually an interesting book to read. That's number one. And the second reason I named this presentation How to Change the World was also because I did not want to dumb down today's content because I'm talking to students. What I'm talking to you about is exactly what I would talk to a corporate executive, by the way, right? The language I use, at least about what we're discussing in poverty, is the same essentially because like Ms. Kavita started in the beginning, I hope some of what I'm saying today stays with you and shapes you in a way that is either subtle or overt in terms of what you're going to do going forward. And if this is my one chance to do it, I just want to give it my best shot, right? So that's the sort of ambition that I want to start with. We finished the quiz. I want to start from this picture. So my son studies at Neve, and I asked him, some tips and advice on how to talk in the session. And he told me, whatever you do, don't talk about yourself. It's the most boring thing. And I agree. But I thought that some of what I went through actually will be interesting for today's conversation as well, because a lot of people talk about poverty from a lens of the larger society. It's never a personal story, right? And I want to tell you about a research study as we go forward about it. And so this picture is actually my home. This was where I grew up. Not this big home, but this little shed on the side. This is actually my house. So my house was a shed with a couple of rooms, and I stayed here.
But this slide hasn't changed.
Okay. Yeah. Let me share it again and let me know whether this works.
Yes.
Is it working? Yeah. Excellent. So yeah, so this is my home, and this is a shed that you could sort of see, which is really where I grew up. This shed plus 2 rooms, and this is where we sort of started my life, and it sort of was a place where my where I did all my education and moved on before I went to college, where we shifted to another house. And the idea what I want to share here was also that this sort of representation is what we have of a poor person today, right? Like if I show you pick this picture and say, think of the person who lives in that home, would you consider him poor? I'm guessing a lot of you would say, yes, that would be a poor person, right? But actually, when I grew up, I did not feel I was poor at all. I realized later that, yeah, that was what was poverty, because one, I had a father who was very, very hardworking, and he worked in a factory. So he used to bring his work home, and we used to actually work at home and so on. And there was a deep respect to work ethic, which I think I still continue to have, which came from him. My mom is extremely intelligent, but is also extremely smart. So she was very curious and had a habit of always learning at home, even when I was in school. So she actually continued to go for some class or the other as I was going to school. So which meant that learning and curiosity was a huge part of what I did as well. I had very inspiring grandparents. One of my grandfathers actually started a school for people who were considered scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. If you understand the caste system, there are people who are lower caste who at that point in Kerala were not allowed to go to school. And my grandfather was one of the first people who actually started a school for them, went to their homes and took their children to actually go to school, and the school still continues to stay. So he sort of gave me a sense of the values, right, on what is important and what change is possible. And my grandmother, actually, on the other hand, was a convent educated, English-speaking person for that age, so pre-independence era. Think of a woman in a household who actually can speak English, and and actually brought her children up, my own father, up with an ability to speak and write English. I was also part of a lot of initiatives. I was part of the RSS at that point in time. They used to have a program for school children where I learned a lot about actually working with people outside of my circle. Because they took me to very different places. I was also part of an initiative called Bal Vikas, where they talked about religion, spirituality, and so on. And I love to read. There were a lot of libraries, both in school and at home, that I leveraged a lot. So my understanding of the world at that time was not that I was a fairly poor person and I was disenfranchised in any way. This set of people and things actually shaped my identity. And I want to come to this part as we talk about the story a little bit, right? In terms of why I'm bringing this up right now. At the same time, as this life was happening, there were a whole bunch of people in my life who were actually very kind to me. And I say this many times when people ask me about my life. I say that I've lived thanks to the kindness of strangers. Like really random people were nice to me, for some reason or the other. My dad worked in a company called TI, and a lot of the employees that he worked with, people that he knew, actually helped us out. They gave me books. One of them actually provided the signature for me to get a loan for my education, etc. So there were people from his company that actually sort of supported my education as we did this. I was also part of this exam called the National Talent Search Examination, which actually gave me scholarships to study when I was in school. So from grade 6, I haven't actually paid school fees because a lot of the scholarship actually took care of that as well. And there is this gentleman, he's a father of one of my friends. When I finished my 12th grade, I actually did not even know that there was a college called BITS Pilani. Like I didn't know it existed. So he actually had an application form for his son. He saw that I had a good education and a good score in 12th grade. So he actually gave me his son's application form and said, why don't you apply? And that literally changed my life. That one act of just, compassion and kindness got me to a very, very good college, which I didn't even know about, and gave me the education that I wanted. And there was a bank which gave me a loan to study because BITS Pilani was expensive. At that point in time, I think it's still expensive. And I went to this bank asking for a loan. It just happened that the bank manager's son was going to BITS Pilani the same year. So he just was kind and said, listen, why don't I give you a loan and you can go to college? And subsequently, BITS themselves gave me a loan, which was great. So thanks to, they had a merit scholarship where students who studied well got some additional scholarships, which actually made sure I finished college. And finally, I got to a business school in France right after my college, so that by the time I finished my college education, I'd actually paid off my loan, which for a lot of you who are going to get into college, you will realize college loans are a thing. And for me to finish my undergraduate education without any loan gave me a lot of freedom on what I wanted to do. And all of these were acts of kindness, right? I really didn't do anything for these people. None of the people that you see here, either my father's colleagues or the scholarship folks, people at BITS, my father's friend, none of them. They just were kind. And that kindness, I think, really got me to where I was. But in addition to that, there are a couple of things that I want to show you, which you might not intuitively think about. I don't know if any of you know these people, and I don't know if you can use your chat or the Q&A, but maybe any of you who know answers to the names of these people, if you do recognize them by any chance, if you're old enough to recognize them, if you can leave it in the Q&A or a chat, if you could, I think that'll be great. Otherwise, I'll talk about it. Yeah. Let's see. One is Manmohan Singh. That's correct. This gentleman is Manmohan Singh. He used to be the prime minister, but actually he was the finance minister. And this gentleman here was called P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister of the country. And they did something incredible when I was 10 years old. What they did was they opened up our Indian economy. So this was 1991. Till then, India had a very different economic structure. No foreign company could come into India. We had very, very limited economic opportunities. And in 1991, these two people decided that India needs more money, and hence foreign companies have to come inside, and they literally changed the futures of almost all of us. And I just happened to be 10 at that point in time, so that by the time I was 17, the economy had boomed and I had job opportunities. Yeah. And these are two other people. Again, I don't know how many of you recognize these two people. They are two entrepreneurs, if I can give you a hint. They started two of the largest companies in India at that time, and now are two of the largest companies, which essentially built an entire generation of IT companies in IT companies in India. So one is Azim Premji, the other is Narayana Murthy. They started Wipro and Infosys respectively. Both of them are huge behemoths. What they two showed was that Indian entrepreneurs can build global companies, which inspired an entire generation of young people to start companies. And today, if you look at it, Zomato that went IPO recently was bigger than the entire hospitality sector. And that's an IT company. And you ask them where they come from, it's probably on the footsteps of these entrepreneurs, right? And again, I'm sharing this because what is a way out of poverty sometimes is extremely interesting to see. Sometimes it's kindness, sometimes it's government reforms, and sometimes it's entrepreneurship, right? All of this actually pave a way to sort of helping us be kind and taking people out of poverty. Yeah. So to summarize, I talked about where I came from, where I grew up, what sort of background I had. I talked about all the things that happened between a 5-year-old version of me to a 21-year-old version of me that sort of set my life in course. But one thing that was very clear at this time was that I owed my life and my success to a lot of people. So I was very clear that I wanted to help poor people. I was sitting in France as part of my first job. I came back to India saying I would want to help poor people, and said, how do I do that? Right? And for a lot of us, that's the first question. Like, you might have the intent to say, I want to help poor people, but how do you help poor people? And so by 2004, I was back in India, and I realized that there are 3 types of organizations that help poor people. One are organizations that actually help the poor directly. This is mostly what we have in mind when we talk about organizations helping the poor. They're called nonprofit organizations. I joined this firm this NGO called Spastic Society of Karnataka. They were a nonprofit organization that worked with children who had spastic, like a physical condition, and needed support. And they used to train these children, provide them support, etc., and support poor families who had such children with any sort of financial support they needed. And I used to go there every Friday and work with them. But then I realized that there were other organizations who were helping these organizations help the poor. They were giving these organizations money. They're called funders. They were giving them advice. They were giving them all sorts of support. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I don't just have to work with the poor. I can work for organizations who help the organizations that work with the poor. And then I realized there are a third set of group of people, which is people who engage citizens on how to be socially responsible, you know, and where they're not working with the poor, but they're getting citizens to be more responsible and more giving, because the more responsible citizens become, the more we are able to address poverty. And I loved all of these three circles and said, let me try all of these three. So I started with the first one, where I worked with nonprofit organizations as a volunteer. And I said, you know what, I'm going to spend my Sundays and Saturdays with children who are from such conditions and help them. That went on for a while. And I said, listen, I'm not getting a lot of satisfaction doing this because I'm just spending my time. And every Sunday when I left, the kids used to say, are you really going to come back the next week? And I was like, this is really not solving the problem. Then I went to the company that I was working with for SAP, and I said, why don't we fund these organizations that are working for the poor so that they actually hire more people and rather than rely on volunteers? So I set up the CSR in this company called SAP. That went on for a while. But again, it was hitting a certain bar where I said, listen, I want to do so much more, but the company only wanted to do this much. And that wasn't meeting my ambition again. Then I said, why don't I start a magazine along with my friends? So we actually started a magazine called Sattva, where we started writing about poverty and poor people and said, listen, the more we write about it, the more people will see this, and the more they will support issues such as these, etc. Which was, again, very interesting because this was our own initiative. We could do whatever we want. Every month we released a magazine talking about the poor, but it was still on the side. You know, like I was doing my real job and I was trying to do this on the side. And finally, around 2009, I realized all of this is a hobby. If I really want to do this full time, I have to start my own company. And I started a consulting firm, which started working with nonprofit organizations, saying, you are a nonprofit organization, you want to create more impact, I want to support you. I'm going to run and give you consulting, and I'll talk a little bit more about what consulting is. But this is going to be my full-time job. So I actually quit my job at SAP, started this firm with 3 of my other friends from college, and today this is what I do full-time. I also want to talk about using this map, what I asked you earlier, who works with the poor? As you can see, there are nonprofit organizations that work with the poor. Companies work with the poor, not just as part of their CSR today, but sometimes directly, helping families get jobs and, and get enough quality of life. There are media companies that work for the poor. There are consulting firms, for-profit startup organizations like ours that work with the poor. There are also today startups that work with the poor, people who create medical devices, people who create loan solutions, people who can provide logistics. There are a whole range of companies that are actual startups that actually work for the poor as well. And these companies are actually funded by investors. So when I asked you earlier, a lot of you said investors don't work for the poor. There is a group of organizations called impact investors, which is investors that invest only in impact. Companies like Acumen are investors who invest only in impact, and they are available. And there are also organizations like petition platforms and e-commerce solutions. E-commerce platforms where you can buy things, but those things are sourced from the poor, which ensure that they share a lot of the money they make with the poor people to improve their lives. And that's really how Fab India, that a lot of people know of, actually started, which is to say, how can we give artisans money and so on. So this is essentially the type of organizations that actually work on the poor. A lot of us imagine it to be only this. And the reason I wanted to share this slide is because the ways and the types of organization that work with the poor are very many, right? And it's a lot more interesting and a lot more complex than what we can understand from the get-go. Started Sattva, and I added this slide because in my son's class today, they talked about Ikigai, and they asked, do you know what Ikigai is? And I said, it's only appropriate that I say that Sattva is my Ikigai. It is what I love. It's something that I'm good at. I'm good at consulting. I do believe this is what the world needs because we're able to serve the people we need to and actually pays my bills. I'm able to put my son in Neve. So it's probably, this green is the green of Sattva for me from an Ikigai point of view. But let me come back to the question that I asked you earlier, which is, who are the poor, right? And this is not a simple question. It's not one of those trick questions where I ask you, and poverty line is a great way to think about it, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. And it is nuanced in 2 ways, right? And I know I'm close to time, so I'm going to take another 5 minutes and come to the Q&A. It's a lot more nuanced because one of the things that we all do when we think of poor people is to think of somebody we don't meet or we are not related to at all as poor, So a person who's begging on the street is poor person. We don't know him. We're going to meet them only at the signal, but that's all we know of them, right? Or we think of them as living in rural India where they have no money, no food, etc. But the truth is that poverty is actually all around us and comes in very many different ways, right? One of the first things I tell people is, ask people is your maid poor, right? Some people say yes. And I ask them, does your maid have food to eat? Yes. Is your maid below the poverty line? No, she's not below the poverty line. Does your maid's son study in school? He does. So then why is she poor? Because a lot of what you said was not true there, right? But so is the maid not poor? But that a lot of times does not seem right because the maid does seem poor. So understanding what we consider poor and disadvantaged, I think, is very, very important. We use this definition at Sattva, right? One, we look at people, which is the standard definition of people who have access to, don't have access to things that we think are very critical: education, healthcare, food, housing and jobs, etc. If people don't have access to this, we can definitely consider them to be poor, and there are a lot of people who don't have access to good healthcare. I don't know if you know, of all the money poor people spend, all the money they spend, 65% of that money they spend in healthcare, which means that if you give them high quality, cheap healthcare, they can actually move out of poverty, right? So quality healthcare is actually a huge crisis in India. And we are working in India. For example, my previous meeting was with a team that's actually trying to improve healthcare in one of the poorest states in the country. Yeah. Second, and this is something not many people think of, is right to participation. People are poor also if they don't have a way to represent themselves or have a voice. I don't know if you know, for the longest time, Switzerland did not allow its women to vote. And I know you had a lot of you had a course on democracy earlier as part of your curriculum. The democracy has evolved for the longest time. Like Black people in America did not have vote. Women don't have vote. And there are some beautiful movies like Newton, which you should see to show what does voting actually mean for India today, right? Like we sort of assume it to be something that happens in our neighborhood in a primary school, but in many parts of the country, voting is still not a right a lot of people enjoy. And one of the brilliant things about India, and I know that it's been spoken about it in your school before, is that we are one of the few countries which still have poverty and democracy at the same time. If you look at the rest of the world, most of the countries that are democracies are actually rich and well-to-do countries. And we started with this belief that we need to have democracy even when we did not have the economic empowerment. But in many countries today, what we're talking about voting, Afghanistan today, for example, a lot of what you would call right to participation does not exist there. In that sense, that's a poverty as well. Third is resilience to vulnerability, which is when bad things happen, it affects poor people more than the rich people, right? A large part of people in India today, 165 districts of India are at a high risk of climate change-led disasters that one bad year, a huge flood, a lot of people will become poor. Yeah? Which is that they will lose their house, they will lose healthcare, education, housing. And this is 165 districts. India has 740 districts today, which means it's a substantial chunk of districts where there are people today who are at the risk of becoming poor because they don't have the highest resilience to vulnerability. I talked about healthcare costs being high, and I know insurance is a complex topic, but very, very few Indians, less than 10% of Indians who are poor actually have insurance, which means that one health risk in their family, they're going to be poor for many, many generations sometimes. And last is people who have no fundamental rights. They don't have the right of equality. They don't have the right to freedom. We work with people who are migrants who are actually put in forced labor, which means that they are put in shops or in construction sites where they don't have the ability to actually leave the site if they want to, because they are called bonded labor. So they have to continue working till the person says they have to work, and they will only get paid after they work for 3 months, and they will not get paid before that. And that's actually illegal today, and that happens in India. And that again is a form of poverty, right? So poverty actually comes in very many different ways. And I think it's extremely important for you to understand that it's not a topic that's just money, right? It is a whole bunch of things that are connected. And I think that is important to know. 2 more slides and I'll pause. What do we do? How do we solve poverty? And I take my own example. One, economic growth solves poverty. Sounds very simple. A lot of times people think of all the ways you can solve poverty, but one of the most important ways is economic poverty. India took 135 million people out of poverty between 2005 and 2015. So to my first question, have people become moving out of poverty or going into poverty? India is actually fastly moving out of poverty. As per our numbers before the pandemic, of course, the pandemic has been hard. And that huge 135 million people moved out of poverty because of economic growth. Because more companies came, more entrepreneurs came, more companies started, revenue came, etc. And that is happening through entrepreneurs, banks, financial institutions, etc. The second way to solve poverty is reform, which is really working with government and creating reform. This is where we talked about Manmohan Singh and P.V. Narasimha Rao, which is to create policies that will grow businesses, create policies that will safeguard the interest of the poor, and so on. Third is philanthropy, which is what, let's say, Sattva does, which is how can we use money that is not business money, but money meant for the poor in a way that supports the poor. How can we create innovations that help the poor? How can we create solar lamps, for example, that can work for the poor? How can we create toilets that work for the poor? And Bill Gates spends a lot of money on that, right? So there are ways to solve poverty, which is philanthropy. And all of these, you can imagine, is hard to get, right? Like, what can a naive student do about economic growth, reform, or philanthropy? But the last lever to solve poverty is actually compassion, right? I talked about a friend of my father. I talked about my father's friends, etc. They solved poverty, right? I am out of poverty as a person because they showed compassion. And that's just donating to the poor, helping people in need, etc. And it's funny that in India, every religion, by the way, not just Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity, every religion actually promotes compassion. Of all the money that India donates for the poor, 90% of that goes to religion, by the way. 90% of the money that we donate in India goes to religion. And that comes from a place of compassion and what our religion truly believes. And a lot of these religious institutions actually help the poor. And when you think of solving the poor, I think it's important for you to sort of think about this more holistically by keeping all of these four things in mind. Lastly, what can you do? I think it's a very important question because a lot of this seems high up there and you are like 12 years old, 14 years old. I would suggest do a combination of head, heart, and hand. Head, be genuinely curious, right? Like really be curious about why people are poor. A lot of times, even grown-up people tell me people are poor because they're stupid, right? And my son and I find that word extremely offensive in general, but to say that and to believe that people are poor out of their own fault is extremely hard, right? So why does poverty happen? I think understanding that will be very, very critical. Two is hands, like do something, volunteer with a nonprofit organization, start with your apartment, do something there, run a campaign if you want, start something online. There is so much kids can do today that they couldn't do earlier at my time because there is availability of resources. And lastly is hard, just show kindness, don't worry about, are you solving the problem? Every person you meet, if you can demonstrate kindness and compassion, and if you can donate, respond to a crisis every time there is a problem, I think that's a great way to solve poverty as well, right? And question that's up to us is really, why are we doing it? Like a lot of people can say, and as you grow up, you'll hear this more often, why do I even have to work on solving the poverty? And for me, there was this anecdote that I want to share. I once went to Rajasthan and I was helping somebody there. And there was this old man who came to me and said, "Aap ye kyun kar rahe ho? Like, why are you doing this?" And I said, "Aapke bhale ke liye kar rahe hain hum ye sab and all that." I told him, "I'm doing this to help you." He said, "That's fine, but why are you doing this?" I said, "To help you." I said, no, you don't understand my question. He said, "What is in it for you? Aapko isme kya fayda hai?" And I told him, I was so offended. I said, I got upset. And I said, "This is not for my benefit. This is for you. I'm helping you." And this old man smiled and said, "You never do anything for other people, right? You always do something for yourself." And I was 25, 27 at that point in time. And for me, it was like a bulb, right? It was a moment where I realized that this entire idea that I'm helping other people was a communication narrative, but what I was truly doing was helping myself, right? And looking back, actually, at the last 12 years, I recognize that I understand the country that I come from a lot better because I do what I do, right? Because otherwise, I've been to the remote districts of Orissa. I met Naxals in Jharkhand who've lost hands in communal riots. I met people in Punjab who've gone through horrible, situations, and I just understand the country and the society that I belong to better. And equally importantly, I think I understand myself better now. I know my biases. I know what I like, what I don't like, what I think of people, what are my true values, not what I say I have to other people, but what truly is my value. And I think this journey of helping other people is actually a journey of helping myself, right? And that's sort of what I would leave you with as I'm finishing my talk, saying you can listen to all of this and assume that you're doing this to help other people. But why I will ask you to do this is because you have to help yourself. Yeah. Kavita, sorry, I've been late, but love to take any questions that came up.
Fine. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just a few more. I'll start off with just asking you a few questions, and students, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I'll pick them up as I go along, but I just have a couple of questions first. On Sattva, if you could tell us a little bit about Sattva, is this a kind of consulting firm that exists at other parts of the world, other parts of the country? Is this usual to have a consulting firm that's focused on social impact consulting? How large is your team today at Sattva? Where do you consult? Is it only India? Is it rural India, urban India? Just give us a little bit of information on that, because students haven't ever looked at a consulting firm that works in social impact. You will have a McKinsey, and McKinsey will have an arm that works in social impact, but not a consulting firm that exists directly for this purpose and makes money as a result of that.
Absolutely. So great question. So when we started in 2009, Kavita, we were actually one of a kind. So there are not too many organizations at that point in time that said, I'm going to start a for-profit consulting organization that's going to create impact. And there was a lot of doubt and disdain in the ecosystem saying, oh, you're trying to make money out of poverty, and that's really what you're going to do. I think today, thankfully, the situation has changed. There are many organizations that are for-profit organizations that truly bring the commitment to create impact. I do have to admit, though, that the consulting firm universe is still a small one compared to the mainstream world. There are probably 10 or 12 very really good consulting firms in India that do the work that we do. There are global precedents. There are organizations that are global organizations that are based out of India as well, who do impact work. But I think compared to the mainstream consulting industry, this is still a small chunk. That's number one. About us, we started in 2009, 12 years old as a company. We are 280 people strong right now, largely in Bangalore with 80 people, but we also have offices in Mumbai and Delhi, and an office in Washington, DC, and an office in Denmark as well. We work all across the country today. Interestingly, we have a project in Ladakh and a project in Kanyakumari. So we actually scale the two opposite ends of the spectrum. And we have a team that's sitting right now in Northeast, helping a cancer hospital there to get better. So I think we span this length and breadth of the organization, of the country. But in addition to India, we work in about 11 countries in Africa, where we create work. And we also work in Bangladesh and in Nepal as well. But a lot of our karma bhumi is really India, but a lot of this is offshoots from our work in India extending to other countries. But in 3 years, we definitely want to be a global consulting firm working on impact that's based out of India. That's the second question. Who do we work with? That's the third question. 4 primary stakeholders that we work with. One are large foundations, people who create these organizations to create impact. So we work with the Gates Foundation, with Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Omidyar, Tata Trusts created by the Tata family, Azim Premji's philanthropy initiatives, etc., where they have these large institutions where we work with them to create new programs and implement programs better. Second part of our work is with corporates. We work with 280 companies in one form or the other in India to help them create impactful programs and so on. The third is nonprofit organizations that people work on the ground. We work with 180 of them in helping them become more effective. And lastly, government. So we started working with the government now and improving government's ability to deliver better impact.
Right. So that brings us to the question of impact. How do you measure impact? And I think it's one of our students has read the article that you wrote, and she just she's considering the impact for her own project, and therefore raising the question that she says, but in my case and many other students I know, this is Meher Sohal asked this question, we have anchored ourselves to a combination of self, system, and poor, and truly do care about what we are working towards. But that is difficult. But what is difficult is actually making and measuring impact. I think this is one of the reasons some of our projects don't get very far. And how can we translate them into something that makes impact? How do you, as your projects, when you're running your projects, she wants to know, how do you measure impact, and how might she think about measuring impact?
Excellent. Great question.
Should she is my tag along question, that I'm always pushing them to look at measuring impact. Is that the wrong thing to do at this stage? Should I just let them work on, and on doing good and not worry about measuring impact? All of those questions.
Yeah, it's a very existential question. So I'm going to try and do my best. So at Sattva, we have an impact framework. We see ourselves as a catalyst organization. So the point is that we are, we are very clear, we are not the ones that are solving the problem. There are people who are solving problems. We are making them more effective. So what we measure is how much have we catalyzed impact. So we measure, for example, how many organizations have we strengthened because of our work, and how much of the capital going to those organizations have we actually influenced. And for example, last year, 600 crores worth of investment by companies was managed by Sattva. So that's a number we look at to say, are we really managing the scale of impact that we are doing? So that's one thing we measure. The second thing that we measure ourselves is in collaboration, which is, are we truly fostering collaboration across different people? How much are we doing? What are we doing? And are we moving the sector itself forward rather than individual people? That's the second part of the impact measure that we do. The third part of the measure we do is, are we making capital go to places where it might not normally go? The ironical thing about India is the richest states get the most philanthropic money. Maharashtra is the richest state in India. It actually gets the most philanthropic capital. Jharkhand, Orissa, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh are the poorest states in India. They actually get very limited capital. So a lot of our focus is, how can I take money from the places where it is probably not as needed to the places where it's most needed. And we actually measure the amount of capital we move to places where it's most needed. So that's those are the three big measures of impact that we have. But in addition to this, we have project level impact that we measure as well, which I possibly of time I might not get into. And to the second question about how would we measure impact, I think I always say the rigor of measurement is in the eye of the beholder. There is all sorts of measurement that you can have to measure impact has happened or not. There are people who spend millions not in creating impact, but in measuring impact. They just run experiments to measure impact, millions. So I think the question that you have to ask yourself when you're doing this is, hold an anchor that you believe in and measure the difference to that anchor. And I'll give you a simple example. You wanted to help a child by giving the child a laptop, right? Hold the child as an anchor. Go back 3 months later and say, is the child actually learning better, right? That's the only thing that you need to know. What is your anchor? And that from that anchor's lens, is there change that has to happen? The only request is to not stop at the point where you've given the laptop, right? Because just going back and saying, and you don't have to do any measurement to say, I will look at your scores. Have you passed your 10th standard? Where are you against your peers? None of that. Is the child learning better? Are you satisfied that the child is learning better? You're working on a lake project, right? Ask yourself on that one anchor, which is probably that you wanted the people around the lake to be more responsible about the lake. Has that happened? Right? It doesn't have to be that the lake is purified now and only then the impact is created. Whatever is your anchor to the problem that you're solving, ask yourself if that anchor is moving. I think that's important. And it's perfectly okay to not see value, by the way, right? If you haven't created impact, and that's perfectly okay, because the valuable lesson is in that is by measuring, it's not as much that you can take credit for what you change, but it's you actually understand what it takes to actually create impact. And that's the only thing I would say. Yeah.
Switching gears on existential questions. First one is, why is India poor? Ira Dwivedi, our PYP reporter, chief reporter PYP, grade 5, wants to know, why does poverty exist and why do some people have poverty and some not? Yeah.
So, there is, this is a great question. We spend a lot of time thinking about it, right? So I want to answer this question.
Economic growth is what will remove poverty finally, right? And India has economic growth. It's one of the fastest growing economies. We've shot through, pushed Germany lower and gone above Germany. We've crossed Great Britain. We've crossed the UK. So why are people still poor?
So let's assume this, right? Let's have 4 buckets. Okay. One bucket is fully open. The second bucket is partly open. The third bucket is fully closed. And the fourth bucket has a little hole through which water can go in. And you pour a ton of water, right, onto these 4 buckets. Which of the buckets will be the most full, right? The one that's most open, intuitively, are you going to say is the most full, right? That's exactly how economic growth works. When economic growth happens, it's just pouring a lot of water onto the society. But certain sections of the society are very ready to accept that water coming into them and actually grow economically through that. And certain sections of the society never actually get the water because they're either fully closed or there's a little hole through which their water has to go. So the question is, why? What is that thing that you're covering the bucket with? And that's really what is causing poverty, right? Some of it is just structural aspects of the society, right? People from lower caste have often had challenges in accessing a lot of the benefits that we have to access in rural India. So they don't get to sit in the same schools, they don't get to access the same resources, they don't have the money to spend on the things that will actually make them rich, which means even when the water is coming, they're covered because they just don't have access to it. People with disability, for example, like most people with disability in India never leave their homes, which means they're stuck in their homes for the rest of their lives. Of course, they're poor, right? So this is, sorry, one thing. So this is one part of poverty, which is structural issues, right? The second thing that I think makes people poor is also the fact that resources that they relied on today are actually depleting very, very quickly. You know, a lot of times people leave Orissa and come to other parts of the country, and I ask them why, because the land that they worked on is not fertile anymore, because they've used too much fertilizers. The villages that they have stayed in have actually gone underwater now because there's so much flooding. The places that they live in don't have livestock anymore. So which means the resources where people actually depend and have their lives on is actually getting worse. That's the second thing, right? The third thing that people are actually becoming poor is also because of social conflict. Every time we have a social conflict, every time there is a disruption, people lose lives, right? When people lose lives, people lose an earning member of the family, and then it's very hard for them to build back, right? So there are structural faults that continue to exist, but there are forces of nature, there are forces of economics, there are forces of, society that actually pull people down into poverty. So society, you can imagine, is 2 efforts that are running in parallel. There are things that pull people into poverty. A dowry, like you paid money for your daughter's wedding, you moved into poverty. You had a healthcare crisis, you moved into poverty. And there are things that are done to pull people out of poverty. Education pulls people out of poverty. Livelihood pulls people out of poverty. And what we have to do is to make sure that the ones that pull people out of poverty work much faster than the ones that pull people into poverty. And that's really the only way we're going to solve poverty. Yeah. Ira, I hope that helped. Yeah.
Thanks. I think response to many other questions as well. Janvi wanted to know that over the last decade, there's been a significant increase in socioeconomic disparity. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Poor are not getting poorer necessarily, Janvi. They are advancing as well. But yes, it's very slow. Policies and systems ensure that this disparity continues. How do we as citizens work towards not bridging, but at least reducing the gap? What everyday lifestyles can create this impact? Ritvik has a question on capitalism and saying that, is our capitalistic society is always going to be about this. For someone to be successful, someone will have to be extremely unsuccessful. So, if you could round up on that, and maybe then we move to just the question on CSR and why in India, why is India this big CSR capital of the world? It's the only country where capitalistic companies, are required to do CSR. So we will move to that. But if you want to just round up a little bit on this thought process of, is the disparity increasing? Is this a result of capitalism?
Yeah. So I think capitalism is everyone's favorite target, right, to hit, and rightly so. If there was a period of time where everybody argued that the only god that capitalism serves is the shareholder. But let's be fair that there are very, very few social models that have been as successful to help people move out of poverty as capitalism has. And that's the truth. There was an entire counter narrative about communism that was created to say this will help poor. But I think what we have truly realized is that ensuring the agency of the people to move out of poverty is the biggest secret to solving poverty, right? Which capitalism does offer. But at the same time, to sort of pray at the holy grail of poverty and say, capitalism is that's going to solve all problems. is also not the answer, right? So my request is for everybody who's listening to this to think of society as always a tension between multiple forces. There is a force of money, right? Capitalism, creating markets, etc. There is a force of regulation, which is what the government has to do to make sure that people are not taken advantage of, that justice is swift. There is a force of growth, which is where we invest in people, help them have good education and so on, so that they can benefit from the money. And there is the focus on equity, which is make sure everybody is within the same space. And there is never one thing that's going to solve the problem. A great society is where there is a healthy tension between all of these four. Any society that's taken one of this and said, this is the only thing that's going to solve poverty is actually ultimately failed. And in India, we've constantly sort of turning the knobs to understand what is the right sort of pressure to have. From 1947 to 1991, we had a healthy disrespect for money. We said money is what corrupts everything. Government is going to solve all problems, and that didn't go too well. And then we said, let industry come in, but we're still very, very cautious about industry because we still have that belief that they're going to, take us all for a ride. And I think overall, what is an ideal state for India is when all of this is able to come together, And there is a question about what can everyday lifestyle choices make, how can they make a difference? The answer is it can. And the most important thing that every consumer should tell a company who they are a customer of, right? The soap you buy, the brush you buy, is the fact that you care about the society and you care about the environment. The only person every company listens to is the customer. Right? And today, most Indian companies don't care about environment or society because they don't think customers really care about it. The more and more we show to the companies that we care about it, I think the better it's going to get. So my request in some sense is to say, how do you as a person make responsible choices for the society and the environment in every choice you make, And you can always imagine, I'm just a student, what am I going to do? When millions of people do this, the shift automatically starts to happen. Yeah, so this is the other question. So I answered the capitalism question. I answered the question on inequity. I did partially answer that question as well. Yeah.
So inequity is it is where it is, and I think it's only economic growth that's going to take us out of this as a society.
Maybe I can add one point to that, Kavita, if it's okay. Maybe it's a nuanced point, but I still, a lot of the Asian countries like South Korea, Taiwan were actually much worse than us when we got our independence. Today, they're much better. And one of the things that they did, and we didn't do, right, is they truly empowered their manufacturing sector. The thing about manufacturing sector is that it creates jobs for a lot of people, and it creates jobs for not just the most skilled people in a society. It creates jobs for everybody, right? India in 1991 took an approach of actually going to the services sector. So if you look at where we are the number one, which is software services, all of that. So software services don't create jobs for everybody. They create jobs for the really smart people. Part of the reason why the inequity in India is growing is because our manufacturing sector hasn't grown as much as our services sector, which means that a lot of people are not getting jobs. It's a little economic point, but it's important to understand that in India, part of the reason economic growth has not resulted in high equity, though it has moved a lot of people into poverty, is because inherently services sector favors a small group of people who are very, very smart and disfavors the people who are, who don't have a set of skills. And that is making it worse.
Yes, we've gotten into a tough little triangle because of that, because the services sector and manufacturing sector, services sector is what has brought money in. It's what has put a lot of people out of poverty. It's what has put India on the map. But yeah, will it move to beyond that now? Make in India, guys. So on that. So last question for you, and this is a tough one. CSR.
Yeah.
India requires companies to do, I'm not sure what percentage of the profit goes into CSR. How much is it?
2%.
2% of the profit. And that's a very large amount of money, right? So what is the quantum of this money, Ratish?
90,000 crores.
90,000 crores that goes into CSR every year, right? Friedman in his epochal essay had said that social responsibility of business is to increase profits. And that's a very polarizing statement, and I think it's given that India requires its companies to do CSR. Is that logical? What's your view on it? It's the only country where this exists, right? It doesn't exist anywhere else.
It is. So I'll just share an anecdote. I was yesterday actually in a conversation with the finance minister of Tamil Nadu. And he is an MIT graduate. It is MBA at Sloan. And we had asked him to release our CSR report. And he started by the same thing, Kavita. When I was in MIT 20 years ago, he actually wrote an essay on why companies should never invest in social impact. And now he's a finance minister of the Tamil Nadu government. And one of the points that he mentioned is that his worldview has changed since the time, Milton Friedman was there. And so has, by the way, the view of the larger capital economy itself. As somebody who's seen this from the ringside, I think the following things are happening because of CSR, which I think are the positives. Number one, in the board conversation, there is actually a conversation today for 1 hour about what is the larger social responsibility of the organization in a manner that aligns and improves the strategic advantage of a company. This is not some middle manager sitting in some cabin and saying, I'm going to write a check and send people. The board is actually discussing this, right? That thinking, I think, if done right, can be truly transformational for what Indian companies stand for and what Tatas have actually been able to show. Number one, which is that it's become a strategic conversation. Number two, companies participating in social impact is actually improving the rigor of the social impact sector, where nonprofits are actually looking at numbers, looking at monitoring and saying, hey, listen, can I actually do this differently than what I was? Because the companies are asking me questions, and the good ones are recognizing that this is actually good input for me to do what I do well. So there is an intersection of talent, which is deeply empathetic to the society and deeply operational, which is what the corporate brings in to create greater impact, which I think is great. Third, collaborations that were hitherto impossible because a lot of the money was international funding. Let's be clear that before these corporates came in, a lot of the philanthropic money in India came from outside of India. It is a huge part of our philanthropic money. We've truly created a domestic source of philanthropic money, which means the questions that we are asking now between government, philanthropy, and people are actually starting to change, right? That's the third. And lastly, thanks to CSR, every employee in a company today, one way or the other, is trying to find out what is their journey and meaning in life. And the number of senior executives who are applying to Sattva, Kavita, and are starting their second careers in social impact, who've actually, because they started their CSR initiative and saw what was happening, is actually incredible. Which means that the talent transition that's happening from mainstream to impact has been fantastic, right? What is the flip side? It is coercive state, it's taxation, sure, but I think the upsides today largely outweigh the downsides.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about bringing accountability, and that's where firms like yours also come in, where CSR, companies don't just look at that money as something that just has to be given away and to projects, but they are accountable for it, and they look at creating impact with checklists, frameworks, decision-making frameworks, strategic plans, all of that. So they start looking at that more long-term. I know that so many foundations struggle. I know the Lupin Foundation struggles, and we've been speaking with you about it. So it's so much to do out there. So I think we will stop there. We've run out of time. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think students are going to come back to you with more to look for guidance in what they can do going forward. I think we live in India, we live in a poor country. Social service or doing better for the environment is all around us. We don't need to look around and decide whether we want to do it or not. If we don't do it, we are being insensitive to where we exist, right? So I think that's what my views on the companies as well. That's what my views on our students and our lives as well. So as they consider impact, as they consider how to make their projects impactful, they will surely come back to you, Ratish. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us.